Number 13. David Hunter. Over a 6-week period in 2017, a thief nicknamed the Dollar Store Grandpa Bandit robbed 10 Dollar Tree and Dollar General stores in at least 8 states. Later identified as 53-year-old David Hunter, the Grandpa Bandit began his crime spree in Connecticut, where he stole a Dodge Charger. He drove it to New York, where he brandished what appeared to be a gun and demanded money. After making off with $1,200 cash and an employee's cell phone, Hunter drove to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, where he continued his crime spree. He went on to rob stores in Michigan, Wisconsin, Nebraska, Utah, Wyoming, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut. Working with other law enforcement agencies, the FBI tracked Hunter to a casino in Lawrenceburg, Indiana. Officers arrested him in the bathroom and took him into custody without incident. Hunter pleaded guilty to stealing the Dodge Charger and to 2 robberies in New York and Idaho. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison, followed by 3 years of probation, and was ordered to pay more than $25,000 in restitution. Number 12. Stephen Gregory Gas. Stephen Gregory Gas robbed a bank for the first time in 1977 in Montgomery County, Maryland. More than 30 years later, in 2010, he pleaded guilty to robbing 19 banks in Florida. He served 9 years in prison and was granted a compassionate release in 2019 for medical reasons. Then, in his mid-60s, he moved back to Maryland, where he lived with his elderly parents. Gas was arrested yet again in 2022 for allegedly trying to rob a Wells Fargo bank in Montgomery County. According to police, he entered the bank wearing sunglasses, a fisherman's hat, and a large face mask. He handed the teller a handwritten note demanding money. The teller walked away while another employee hit the silent alarm button, and Gas left without receiving any cash. Police caught up with him a short while later and arrested him. During the investigation, they connected the 67-year-old to another bank robbery that had occurred about a month earlier. Wearing a similar disguise, he took a similar approach, handing the teller a note demanding cash. He left the scene with an undisclosed amount of money. At the time of his arrest, Gas was also wanted in connection with a bank robbery in neighboring Baltimore County. According to the most recent update on his case, he's being held without bond on several robbery charges. Number 11. Wawan Erawan. 60-year-old Wawan Erawan's murderous crime spree allegedly began when he and his 65-year-old neighbor, Solihin, convinced 2 women that they had a supernatural ability to multiply money. The women gave cash to the elderly pair, but then began to suspect that they were being scammed and demanded their money back. To prevent them from going to the police, Wawan and Solihin killed them. One of the women was dumped into the ocean, while the other was buried outside Wawan's home in Bali, Indonesia. Wawan's mother-in-law, Noneng, had reportedly witnessed the crime, so Wawan killed her to eliminate her as a witness. He then lured Noneng's daughter, Wiwin, one of his 3 wives, to Solihin's house, where the men murdered her. They buried Noneng and Wiwin outside Wawan's house. Their next victim was another one of Wawan's wives, named Halima. Her family believed that she had died from natural causes, and no suspicions were raised. Wawan went on to marry Halima's daughter, Maimuna, who was widowed with 2 adult sons. The first 5 victims' deaths flew under the radar until Maimuna, her 2 sons, and her daughter, who she shared with Wawan, were found dying from poisoned coffee at a boarding house. Maimuna and her sons died, and finally Wawan and Solihin fell under law enforcement's radar. The men were charged with multiple counts of murder, along with a 3rd suspect, 35-year-old Didi Salahuddin, who was found suffering from the poisoned coffee alongside the most recent victims. Salahuddin was reportedly tasked with collecting money from the victims, who were being scammed by the suspects, when he took a sip of the poisoned coffee to convince them that it was safe to drink. He survived and cooperated with the police. During a search of Wawan's property, police discovered the remains of at least 1 more victim, who was also a family member. The murders are believed to have occurred over a 2-year period. An investigation turned up evidence that the suspects were scamming several of their victims in addition to the first 2 women, leading detectives to believe that there may be more victims who have not yet been discovered. If convicted of murder, the suspects could face the death penalty. Number 10. Kwame Seku. 41-year-old father of 3, Winston Bright, vanished from New York City in 1990, leaving his wife Leslie on her own to pay the bills and raise their kids. She would later tell the New York Daily News that he left their apartment in the East Village one day and simply never returned. A year-long police investigation failed to turn up any sign of Winston. His bank activity stopped completely, and there were no records of him using his social security number for any reason. Friends, co-workers, and fellow members at the couple's church all claimed to have no idea what happened to Winston or where he was. After 10 years went by with no answers about her husband's whereabouts or fate, she asked a court to declare Winston legally dead. The request was granted, making her eligible to collect Winston's $300 per month pension. But living in the Big Apple is expensive, and money remained a constant struggle. While Winston's family supported the petition to have him declared dead, Leslie told the Daily News that she didn't hear from them during his absence. Their apparent lack of concern for his well-being led her to wonder if he had run off and was keeping in contact with them. Her hunch that her husband was alive proved correct in 2012 when a 65-year-old man named Kwame Seku claimed that he was Winston Bright and petitioned the court to declare him alive so he could collect his pension. Seku claimed that he had recently emerged from a 20-year case of amnesia, which started when he found himself in California during the early 90s. He went to a homeless shelter and started anew. In 1992, a California state court gave him permission to use the name Kwame Seku since he didn't remember his given name. He eventually earned a master's degree and became a teacher. According to court documents, an aunt tracked the missing man down and recognized him as Winston Bright in 2008. But it wasn't until the following year that bits and pieces of his memory began to return. Leslie didn't believe Seku's amnesia story and remained convinced that he had bailed on his family and ran away to reinvent himself, unburdened from the responsibilities of a family man. His first petition to have the death declaration reversed was thrown out due to a lack of evidence. He petitioned again, this time providing DNA evidence that he was his mother's son, and the court granted his request. Seku ultimately decided not to pursue the pension payments that Leslie was receiving. He has reportedly reconnected with his kids on some level, but it's unclear whether they're close or if he's met his grandchildren who were born during his absence. Leslie told the Daily News in 2018 that her estranged husband calls her every few months from California to check in. Number 9. Eddie Allen Harris. Early one morning in 2021, LAPD officers found a woman dead in an alleyway with multiple stab wounds. They traced the crime to 67-year-old Eddie Allen Harris, who had gone to prison in 1982 for an eerily similar crime. Harris was paroled for the first murder in 2018 after spending more than 30 years in prison. He was on probation for the next 3 years. Less than a month after finishing his probation, he was arrested for the more recent murder. The current status of the case is unclear. Former legislative director for the California District Attorneys Association, Larry Morse, told Fox News that the murder Harris was accused of is one of many examples of people committing heinous crimes during their later years. He said he expected to see more disturbing cases like this after a recent change in California law lowering the elderly parole age to 50. Morse blamed the change on what he described as a headlong rush among state lawmakers to implement misguided criminal justice reforms. But in his opinion, a lot of the new changes were more reckless than reformative. Number 8. Conrado Aliman. While riding the New York City subway in 2018, a woman felt someone brush up against her backside in an inappropriate way. She was surprised when she turned around and realized it was an old man with an otherwise unsuspicious, grandfatherly appearance. Just minutes later, the same thing happened to another woman on the same train. Both victims got off the subway at the same station and reported the incident to police. Authorities identified the suspect as 82-year-old Conrado Aliman and charged him with abuse and forcible touching. It was his 6th arrest in 2 years for groping women on the subway, but he insisted he was innocent. Describing himself as happily married, Aliman accused the 2 women of setting him up. He told reporters that the police followed him because, in his words, they recognized my face and were looking to get someone. The octogenarian was busted for a 7th time about a year later, in 2019. This time, a plainclothes cop was on the train and watched the incident firsthand as Aliman walked up behind a woman and began thrusting against her. The woman got off the train at the next stop and went to the police. Aliman was arrested yet again and was released without bail. His charges from the 2019 incident were still pending when he struck again in 2020. Aliman's repeated arrests generated calls for serial perverts to be banned from public transportation, but city leaders have yet to take meaningful action in this regard. Number 7. Andrew Lester. Ralph Yarl innocently went to the wrong address while he was out looking for his younger brothers in Kansas City, Missouri one evening in April 2023. He rang the doorbell and waited. An elderly white man came to the door and allegedly shot Yarl twice the moment he saw the young African-American man. Yarl was struck in the head and the arm, but was able to run for help. As he rushed toward a neighbor's house, he overheard the old man saying, "Don't come around here." The young man survived his injuries, but is still recovering both physically and from the mental trauma he now suffers from. Police went to the home and arrested 84-year-old Andrew Lester, who reportedly said that he shot the victim because he thought Yarl was going to burglarize his house. He said he feared for his life, but admitted to firing the shots within a few seconds of answering the door. Lester accused Yarl of pulling on the door handle, but Yarl denied the claim. Authorities charged Lester with first-degree assault and armed criminal action. If convicted of the assault charge, he could face life in prison. He was released from custody pending the outcome of the case, sparking widespread outrage among racial justice advocates and community members who believe the octogenarian belongs behind bars while his case plays out. During a news conference, Clay County prosecutor Zachary Thompson conceded that there was a racial component to the shooting, but declined to go any further into detail, stating that he's not going to try the case in the press. Attorneys representing Yarl's family have called on the federal government to investigate the possibility of the shooting being a hate crime. Lester's attorney, Stephen Salmon, has asked the judge to seal the case, arguing that the information that has already been reported has put his client in danger. Salmon said that Lester's house has been egged and covered in graffiti, and that Lester was forced to leave his home for his safety and requires protection from law enforcement when he travels. While one of Lester's grandsons has spoken out in defense of his grandfather, another one of his grandsons, Clint Ludwig, has voiced his support for Yarl. Ludwig told CNN that his grandfather has shown racist tendencies and that he buys into right-wing conspiracy theories. When asked why he decided to speak out against his grandfather publicly, Ludwig said that he believes it's the right thing to do and that people too often get away with killing unarmed, innocent black people. Ludwig's brother Daniel denied that their grandfather is a conspiracy theorist. He told the New York Times that he's close with Lester, unlike other relatives that the press has spoken with, and described Lester as someone who was literally too nice. In addition to the doubts raised by Daniel Ludwig, some neighbors have speculated that Lester was disoriented and scared when he answered the door, considering his age. What will ultimately matter most in this case is what the judge and jury believe. Number 6. Joseph Grucci. The Grucci family of Suffolk County in Long Island, New York, is well known for their professional fireworks shows, but they made headlines for an equally loud but much different type of blast in 2010 when a 911 caller reported hearing gunshots outside the home of 7-year-old Joseph Grucci at 3 o'clock in the morning. Police arrived at the property to find Grucci's 20-year-old grandson, Christopher Geresi, suffering from gunshot wounds to the torso and arm. The hulking 220 pounds, 100-kilogram young man was taken to the hospital where he underwent surgery and thankfully survived. Grucci, who stands at roughly 5 feet 6 inches, 1.7 meters tall and weighs around 150 pounds, 68 kilograms, told responding officers that the shooting happened during an argument with his much larger grandson about noise. He said that he threatened to call the police on Geresi, who responded by attacking him in the driveway. The New York Daily News noted that while Grucci is related to the famous firework family, he was not involved in the business. Grucci was taken into custody on suspicion of first-degree assault. He spent the next week in jail, but caught a lucky break during a court hearing when Geresi said that he didn't want his grandfather behind bars. The judge allowed Grucci to go home while awaiting sentencing after pleading guilty to second-degree assault, but ordered him to stay away from Geresi for a year. During the hearing, Grucci described the incident as terrible and something that never should have happened. He said that his main concern was for his grandson and that he wanted Jurese to get better. The parties involved in the case expected Grucci to be sentenced to probation, but in yet another stroke of luck, the judge sentenced him to time served. By then, the stay-away order appeared to have been lifted, and Grucci had reunited with his grandson. Farrell Sampia. While working at a restaurant in the Lakeview neighborhood of New Orleans one afternoon in 2012, Antonio Miller got into an argument with his father-in-law, 44-year-old Farrell Sampia, over the well-being of his young son. According to police, Sampia confronted Miller outside the business where both of the men worked. Nearby resident Tom Collier later told local station WDSU that he and other neighbors overheard loud voices followed by 8 to 10 gunshots. Customers inside the restaurant ducked for cover, and luckily no bystanders were hurt. Sampia met with homicide detectives later that night and was arrested on a second-degree murder charge. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. In 2021, Sampia's mother, Lois Radcliffe, told Marshall Project journalist Jamil Zlate that her son ended up in an altercation with Miller out of a fierce protectiveness over his daughter and grandson. She claimed that Miller routinely threatened the woman and child, and that Miller had recently sent Sampia a picture of a gun, which he perceived as a threat. Radcliffe said that guns were pulled during the argument outside the restaurant, suggesting that Miller also brandished a weapon shortly before the shooting. The last few years of Sampia's life were spent in a state of severe suffering. In addition to being locked up, he suffered from a neurological disorder called transverse myelitis, resulting from an untreated infection he caught in jail. He became wheelchair-bound, yet hadn't received much medical attention and was not yet aware of his condition. After being transferred from jail to prison, he was placed in hospice care despite still having no official diagnosis. Radcliffe believes that her son's condition resulted from unsanitary jail conditions during Hurricane Isaac, when ankle-deep sewage flooded the cells. She couldn't understand why Sampia was put in hospice, since most transverse myelitis make at least a partial recovery. Despite this, she was initially relieved that her son would finally receive medical care in some form. As a nurse, she had never seen terrible standards of care in a program for terminally ill patients. But Radcliffe was shocked to see the prison hospice conditions, which she described as lacking even basic cleanliness and medical precautions. As Sampia lay there, paralyzed and with open bed sores, nurses allegedly treated him without gloves or masks, including one staff member who smelled unbearably foul and had a running nose that dripped on Sampia. The inmate complained to his mother about not receiving medication he needed, going months without having his catheter changed, and begging staff members for even the most basic care. He was in constant excruciating pain until he died in 2019 from a stroke and a heart attack, marking a tragic end to the consequences of an argument that went too far. Number 4. Carrie Shunk. After receiving a tip from a concerned citizen in 2022, police in Hartford, Connecticut raided the home of 18-year-old Clayton Hobby and his grandfather, 64-year-old Carrie Shunk. They reportedly found an arsenal of illegal weapons and ammunition, including ghost AR-15 assault rifles and several ghost handguns, as well as a bulletproof vest, a black ski mask, and a manual on how to make poisons and bombs. Ghost guns are guns that are difficult to trace or untraceable. Most are assembled behind closed doors, using parts that are 3D printed or obtained discreetly through other means. They don't have serial numbers like traditionally manufactured guns that the government keeps records of, and their existence is unknown to authorities until they're discovered through investigations. The AR-15s found at Hobby and Shunk's home were in various stages of assembly, and one of them had been converted to be fully automatic. Investigators believe that the guns were assembled by Clayton Hobby. According to prosecutors, Shunk had gone to law enforcement and asked them if there was a way to make one of the handguns legal. When he learned that it wasn't an option, he allegedly promised to destroy the gun, but it was found in a shed outside the home during the raid. Shunk's attorney claimed that he had moved the gun to the shed because he wanted it out of the house. But his disapproval of his grandson's hobby wasn't enough to spare him from legal problems. Authorities charged Shunk with 3 counts of conspiracy to commit possession of an assault weapon, 3 counts of conspiracy to commit criminal possession of a pistol, conspiracy to commit manufacture of a machine gun, conspiracy to commit criminal possession of ammunition, 15 counts of conspiracy to commit possession of high-capacity magazines, and interfering with an officer. He bonded out for $25,000, pending the outcome of the case, which appears to be ongoing. Hobby was charged with 3 counts of possession of an assault weapon, 3 counts of criminal possession of a pistol, criminal possession of ammunition, manufacturing of a machine gun, 15 counts of possession of high-capacity magazines, and risk of injury. He was held on a $500,000 bond. Number 3. Thomas Connors. During a traffic stop in Markham, Ontario in March 2023, police searched a vehicle and found several bogus contracts for more than $50,000 worth of home repairs. They traced the paperwork to an elderly victim who paid the phony contractors for work on the inside and outside of the house that was never carried out, including repairs to the roof. Investigators identified 3 UK residents as their prime suspects. They arrested 20-year-old Thomas Jacob Connors and his grandfather, 65-year-old Thomas Connors, on charges of fraud over $5,000, possessing a forged document, and property obtained by crime. According to the most recent update on the case, the third suspect, 39-year-old Jimmy Connors, was still at large. A warrant for his arrest was issued for charges of fraud over $5,000 and possessing a forged document. In light of the arrests, authorities issued a warning to residents to be wary of door-to-door home repair scams. They said not to trust people who show up offering to fix chimneys or driveways or to perform stonework for below market value. Phony contractors often quote prices that seem too good to be true but still amount to a considerable sum of money and request a large deposit in cash before work begins. In most cases, they will either begin the job but never finish it, do the work extremely poorly, or just never perform the work, period. The cases against the Connors family are ongoing. Number 2. Michael Francis Mara. In 2008, a graying middle-aged man began a 20-month crime spree, starting with the robbery of a bank in Richmond, Virginia. Over the next 20 months, he proceeded to rob more than 24 banks in 13 states, including Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Georgia, Arkansas, Kansas, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, New York, Florida, and North Carolina. Nicknamed the Grandad Bandit by the FBI, the serial robber's MO involved entering each bank with no disguise and calmly handing the teller a note demanding a specific amount of cash. In some cases, he made gestures implying that he was armed, but he never actually displayed a weapon. After receiving the money, he exited the bank. The Grandad Bandit's quiet approach worked well. He had a fatherly appearance and didn't come across as the least bit suspicious to bank customers. It took law enforcement a while to track him down, given his ability to blend in well with society and his constant movement. In 2010, the FBI began posting the suspect's photo and information about his crimes on billboards across the US. A tipster identified the robber as 52-year-old Michael Francis Mara of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. After a 6-hour standoff at his home, he peacefully surrendered to authorities. During a search of the house, federal agents found $4,000 in cash and 15 demand notes written on bank deposit slips. Mara had married a school teacher about a year earlier, right in the middle of his crime spree. He reportedly told her that he traveled frequently for work as a FEMA employee. The couple's neighbor, Jerry Hunt, told Desert News that Mara's wife was unaware of the robberies and unsuspecting of her husband. Despite his inconspicuous appearance, Mara had a long criminal history dating back to the 80s when he was convicted of embezzlement and grand larceny in Oklahoma. 2 years later, he rented a car in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and never returned it. He also posed as a sheriff and committed thefts and robberies in multiple states. Mara also had a bizarre obsession with pretending to be an emergency worker. According to Syracuse.com, he met his wife while pretending to be a paramedic at a hurricane evacuee center. He claimed that he had helped with the post-9/11 cleanup in New York City, when in reality he was in prison for stealing a gun. The Grandad Bandit admitted to 25 robberies and pleaded guilty to 2 heists. He received a 25-year prison sentence and was ordered to repay the $83,000 he stole during his nearly 2-year crime spree. Number 1. Pedro Detra. 100-year-old Pedro Detra was handling his revolver at his home in the Bronx one morning in 2017 when he accidentally discharged the weapon and shot himself in the thigh. His neighbor Ricardo Rodriguez told the New York Daily News that his grandfather helped to take care of Detra, who lived alone. Rodriguez said that he heard the gunshot, but it was muffled. Assuming someone or something fell, he thought nothing of the sound. A short while later, his grandfather arrived at the centenarian's apartment with breakfast and found Detra injured. After being treated for his injuries, Detra was arrested. According to police, he bought the gun illegally. He was released on his own recognizance, pending the outcome of his case. There was a lot of speculation about why he was handling a gun in the first place. Rodriguez told the Daily News that Detra had mentioned in the past that he wanted to die, but that he wasn't crazy. He described the old man as a little eccentric, but fine otherwise, and added that he and his grandfather were unaware that Detra owned a gun. The apartment building's super Andy Collado said that the police suspected Detra of shooting himself on purpose. He questioned why someone would have a gun at such an old age and speculated that Detra mishandled the gun, saying that he must have been petting it or something. Thanks for watching. Would you take the rap for a crime committed by an elderly family member to spare them from legal trouble, even if it meant doing a short jail stint and having a conviction on your record? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you soon. Bye.